Well, I mean, we've gone through a huge evolution of what is going on with beer in New York City. I mean, New York City started brewing pretty much as soon as people showed up. Breweries started here. The heyday of brewing in New York City would have been the late 1800s to around 1900. You had more than 100 breweries in Manhattan. You had 48 in Brooklyn. And Brooklyn actually came first because we have a different water supply than Manhattan does. You know, we are on Catskill, Delaware water, whereas most of Manhattan is on Croton-Harmon water. At one time, where the New York City Public Library main branch is at 42nd Street, that is where, and Bryant Park, that's where the reservoir was. So the reservoir was this big walled thing, and the water was horrible. It was disgusting. And so you couldn't make decent beer out of it, so people would move out to Brooklyn to build the breweries. So at the turn of the century, you know, in 1900, 1 out of every 10 beers produced in the United States was made in Brooklyn. It was one of the great brewing capitals of the world. And at that time, you know, the breweries were a big part of everyone's social life because they were huge, you know, beer gardens that held thousands and thousands of people. And of course, after Prohibition wiped out brewing in the United States, and at that time, you know, we had thousands of breweries in the United States. By 1974, we only had 40 breweries left, and they all made one kind of beer, which was essentially flavorless. And I think of brewing as being very much like our food culture, which has had a big comeback, you know, in the last 20 years. But at the time that, you know, I first moved to England, there was really only one kind of beer, and what it really was a beer facsimile, the same way that when you go to the supermarket and you see that big spongy loaf of white bread, you know, it's really a chemical sponge. It's not bread. Bread doesn't have 40 ingredients and stay fresh in a bag for 2 weeks. You know, so we're actually going back to what beer had been before. New York City has actually been relatively slow to catch up with the West Coast, which started the connoisseurship of beer, and that grew out of their connoisseurship for wine, starting in the late 70s and early 80s, and then kind of leapfrogged across the rest of the country to New York City. We kind of got going, you know, in the 80s, though an early pioneer, you know, and that takes me to my early days, was Manhattan Brewing Company, opened in 1984. And they were the first new brew pub east of the Mississippi since Prohibition. So that was an outpost, but we finally have kind of caught up with the rest of the country and in some ways surpassed it. You know, if you go to Gramercy Tavern, you now see that they have a vintage beer list beyond their huge, you know, beer list period. And of course, Gramercy, you know, is among the top restaurants in New York City and therefore the world. So it's, you know, we've come a long way. And there are many great, you know, bars and restaurants here. But what we're really hoping for and what we're seeing is beer, good beer, becoming part of the everyday culture in all bars, not specialist bars and restaurants. Well, I can get myself in a lot of trouble with a question like that. But certainly I wouldn't miss the Blind Tiger, which is the premier beer bar in New York City, down in the West Village. I would recommend going to Gramercy Tavern for getting the sort of fine dining with great beer experience. And you know, there are 2 parts of the restaurant. The tavern room up front is less expensive than the other part of the restaurant, and they don't take reservations, so you can actually get in. Normally, Gramercy Tavern is just sold out for at least a month, and really come and experience that. So from either end, you know, the beer bar end, I'd say that Blind Tiger is at the top of the list. You can also check out the Spotted Pig in the West Village, now become rather famous, so maybe go in on an afternoon sometime. And, you know, they actually have some of the British-style beer on the hand pump, the Cask Ale, to serve with April Bloomfield's tremendous food. So, a place with a Michelin star, you know, and cask conditioned beer, you know, that's a wonderful combination.